Look how Samus is the Metroid! It's the Metroid! There! There's the Metroid! It's the Metroid! What are we gonna do about the Metroids? Metroid! Have a Metroid! There's the Metroid! It's a Metroid! Look how Samus is the Metroid! It's a Metroid! Nobody was talking about the Metroid! Why are there so many Metroids? So many Metroid! Metroid!
Usually around the holidays, I like to take the opportunity to try out some new games. Sometimes that means I'm finally trying out the latest big budget game that I was putting off. Sometimes it means taking a risk on something brand new I've never heard of. But usually it means finally cracking open a classic game that has been sitting on my shelf for ages. This time around, I finally decided to beat Metroid Prime. I have played Metroid games before. I have the NES Metroid on my Wii Virtual Console, and I used to rent Metroid Prime 3, but I was never able to beat either of them when I was a kid. After fighting my way through the Phazon-induced horrors of Landon-Core, I am proud to say that I have finally beaten a Metroid game. Overall, I really enjoyed my experience, even if I kind of suck at it. However, while playing it, I did have something of an epiphany. I think Samus Aran might just be the greatest silent protagonist of all time. The first thing I wanted to do after having this realization is dig into the history of silent protagonists. This likely isn't surprising to anyone with even a basic knowledge of gaming history, but silent protagonists have been around since the beginning. There are some debates on what actually counts as the first video game to even have a storyline and thus have a true protagonist at all. Regardless of what you pick, what can be guaranteed, however, is that the main character of that game will be silent. The rather obvious explanation for this is simply technical issues. An impressive computer in 1983 didn't even have its own internal storage. Meanwhile, my middle-of-the-road computer from nearly 10 years ago had a full terabyte of hard drive space. Making a character talk simply wasn't in the cards for early game devs. And this is the one thing that really interests me so much about silent protagonists, is a narrative design that really only exists in video games and was born not out of artistic experimentation, but out of developers doing the best they could with what they had. In our current day and age, those sorts of limitations are largely gone, yet the silent protagonist remains. The silent protagonist outlived its own reason for creation. In that limitation, developers found something that was unique and captivating in many ways, which means that it's worth exploring. Let me also break down some differences in silent protagonists just so we can all stay on the same page here. Silent protagonists are, of course, silent, but different games do this differently. Some games have the protagonist speak, or assume that the character can speak in some way, while not actually playing a voice line. This is usually done in a lot of games that have a lot of role-playing aspects, so the player can project themselves onto the character by making choices. You can usually pick options off the list for a dialogue in these games. Fallout New Vegas, which is one of my favorite games, is a pretty good example of this type of silent protagonist. Then you have the true mutes, characters who truly do not make noise. You do see these turn up in some RPGs from time to time, but I feel like they're more common in action-focused games. The point of these characters is that they kind of aren't characters. Don't get me wrong, many of them are really developed and interesting in their game's lore and universe. It's just that during gameplay, interacting with other characters isn't something you're usually that worried about. The Doomslayer is a really good example of this type of character. He never really speaks, and all he does is kill. There may be some interesting storytelling going on in that head somewhere, but it's not particularly relevant to the events at hand. The third type is what I like to call the expressive category. These are characters that can, in-universe, have the ability to speak, but these games usually don't tell their stories like traditional narratives, or even as a role-playing structure. Most of the time, these characters express their character and personality through their mannerisms. Take a character like Mario, for example. He rarely speaks full sentences, and even those are usually just his catchphrases. However, you still know a lot about Mario's personality. He's fun-loving, he likes jumping around, yahooing his way through all the levels. When he emotes, he usually doesn't use words, but gestures around, and occasionally wacky cartoon banter happens. The expressive category doesn't just have to be cartoon characters, though. Take Link from Breath of the Wild. He's a pretty serious character, and he fits perfectly well in this category. With that groundwork set, where does Samus Aran fit into this? More so, how can I say that Samus Aran might be the greatest silent protagonist ever? What makes Samus, at the very least, a highly unique silent protagonist is that she doesn't fully fit the mold of any of the three categories. In fact, I'd argue she really has a boot in all three camps. Now, I know narrative design choices like this aren't a hard rule. There are plenty of protagonists who flirt with multiple categories. Samus, however, feels a bit different.
There's something different about you.
The thing that makes Samus worth discussing to me, however, is that she really balances the three categories very well. In most Metroid games, Samus says nothing. You could obviously chalk this up to simply technical limitations again, as stated earlier. The original Metroid, Metroid 2, Super Metroid, and Metroid Zero Mission were all on consoles that simply didn't have the ability to effectively contain voice dialogue. Even the games on SNES and GBA, which would have been able to handle a lot of text-based dialogue, Samus remains mute most of the time. In fact, of the 12 main series Metroid titles, there are only 2 Metroid games where Samus routinely speaks. That's Metroid Fusion and the oft-criticized Metroid Other M. During all this silence, either Samus or the game itself will do things that might push her into one of our big 3 categories, but there are so many opposing forces that it balances out in a way, leaving Samus as a kind of middle ground silent protagonist, capable of taking on the best aspects of all 3 categories.
Perfectly balanced, as all things should be.
One might assume that Samus is a sure thing for the mute category. I mean, on paper, this seems like an obvious choice for her. As established, she rarely speaks, and spends most of her time in-game actively fighting for her life. Sure, that would quantify a mute like the aforementioned Doomslayer, but not really. A basic characteristic of the mute is how little information about the main character is conveyed and how little of it is relevant to the story. Across the Metroid universe, we've actually learned a lot about Samus, and her backstory is a central pillar of most Metroid storylines. For those not in the know, Samus is a human woman adopted by a race called the Chozo and had her genes re-engineered by her adopted parents to make her part Chozo. Almost every Metroid game features the legacy of the Chozo as part of the main story. The first 2 games are all about the elimination of the Metroids, which is a creature invented by the Chozo. Planet Zebes, the main locale of multiple Metroid titles, was the Chozo home planet. Talon 4 from Metroid Prime was a Chozo colony, where the residents prophesied that Samus would come to purge the Phazon that they had managed to contain. Samus' main rival is Ridley, the monster that murdered her biological parents. All of this is way too much backstory and lore to call her a truly mute character. True mutes are characters you don't think about where they come from, even if they have a backstory. Samus has a backstory and a lore that, in many places, poses questions for you to ponder, especially because Metroid is a game that's more about exploration than true combat. Doomslayer is a monster of a character, and his science exists not to distract you from the breakneck gameplay. Metroid games are generally slower paced, with occasional frantic bursts during boss fights. Most of the game is about finding new areas, which puts the player brain in questioning mode. While Doomslayer doesn't really want you to ask questions so as to focus on killing demons, Samus has you thinking things like, now that I have this ability, are there new places to go? Can this enemy be defeated in a different, more efficient way now? And since you're already asking questions, you might start asking questions about who Samus is and why she's doing this. Especially in games like Prime that often include snippets and scraps of lore hidden with the upgrades and unlockables, you might spend as much time wondering about Chozo Phazon prophecies as you spend time trying to figure out where to go next or what to kill. Since we've established that she isn't a true mute, maybe Samus is supposed to be more of a player avatar for you to project onto. Does this mean she is supposed to fall more into our role-playing character category? I admit I like this option. Metroid games rarely explore why Samus is out in the galaxy hunting down monsters. One game kind of does, but we try to ignore that one. There's a lot of avenues that you can interpret Samus' motivation, and all of them can make for really interesting stories. Some like to think of Samus as a hardened woman bent on revenge, training and pushing herself to the limit to avenge the family that was taken from her as a girl by the space pirate threat. And since the space pirates would weaponize Metroids or X-Parasites or Phazon, these things must be purged. Others still prefer to think of Samus as a thrill-seeker, pursuing the path that gives her the greatest opportunity to test her skills and push herself to the limits. I personally like to think of Samus as a woman who would much rather be living a normal life, maybe settling down and have a family of her own, but fueled by memories of her human and Chozo family, feels a sense of duty to keep the galaxy safe, so no more little girls end up like her. The fun of Metroid's storytelling is that all these interpretations of Samus are valid, but it also doesn't make a lot of sense to call Samus a true role-playing type of silent protagonist. While I may be able to project onto Samus to a certain degree, the game doesn't really want you to. There are very few options for player choice in Metroid's narratives, and role-playing feels more like trying to get into Samus' head as opposed to playing as a digital avatar of what you want to be doing in the world. If the other two categories don't work, does that mean that Samus fits into the expressive character like her smashed counterparts like Mario and Link? And no! No, she wears a helmet. You can't see her face. What's wrong with you?
No! I bore this burden for you!
All jokes aside, Samus actually does have some leanings here. Remember how I said that it's hard to roleplay with Samus because she requires you to get into her head instead of her being an avatar for you? Part of that reason is because she is physically incapable of emoting. An avatar is going to emote a little, even if only through your dialogue choices. Samus maintains a hard exterior at all times. With her helmet on, it's impossible to tell what she's thinking, which, in a way, expresses what Samus is like as a character. Look back at Link from Breath of the Wild. That game maintains that Link keeps his silence as a representation of the burden he bears as the hero. When you see him in a cutscene with a stone-faced expression, that doesn't convey a character with no emotion, but one who is doing what they can to bear said emotion in silence. Samus can behave in much the same way. Since she has the Vario suit on in almost all instances, you can't read her expression, which would reinforce some similar ideas in Samus. This is actually pretty useful for getting the player to feel what the game wants them to feel. Metroid games are all about taking on a hostile environment while being totally isolated. Samus expressly not emoting in big ways helps accentuate that feeling of isolation in the player. There's no one else here, there's no one to emote for, all that matters is the mission. However, this falls apart due to what we were saying in the role-playing segment. Without understanding Samus' motivations, we don't know if her helmeted silence is a mask hiding deeper troubles, or a stoic face for a stoic heart. Samus' lack of expression is a form of expression, but only when paired with an understanding of why there is a lack of expression. Throughout this video, I've explained why Samus doesn't fit in any of the normal categories for a silent protagonist. This isn't to rag on Samus, it's quite the opposite. Samus doesn't quite fit these molds because she is something that I think is a bit greater than all of them. Samus is the apotheosis of what it means to be a silent protagonist. She can truly be all things to all players. If you are a person who likes a character you can roleplay as, you can love imagining what is going through her head as you find out more and more about her as a character. If you like a protagonist who is merely a vehicle for you to take on the game's challenge with, you can appreciate how Samus' silence does not interfere with your ability to take on the hostile denizens of space. And if you like a character who you can truly empathize with, you can grow closer to Samus as you both deal with the isolation that is being alone in a dark, dismal corner of outer space. Explaining her motivations would ruin the experience for people who enjoy role-playing as Samus, since any possible written explanation for her will not be as good as the one they invent in their mind. If Samus was routinely speaking, it would distract from the action that the gameplay-minded gamer wants to be focusing on. And if she voiced her own feelings in the moment, it would take away from the feeling of loneliness and solitude that you'd feel as you venture through the planets of Metroid. Because Samus can hit all of these reasons that make other silent protagonists great, I have come to the conclusion that she might just be the greatest silent protagonist of all time. Thank you guys for watching a new video. I'm trying a little something different with the two cameras now. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed the video. Thank you so much for watching. Again, please give it a like and subscribe to the channel for more. Until next time, this has been Landon, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye!